The title of our presentation is Who is High and Who is Low in Musical Tastes, Stratification Inside Cultural Repertoires. Darku, can you move the slide, please? It is broadly accepted that distinction into highbrow and lowbrow culture dimensions and omnivariants are indeed compatible. The same applies to the cosmopolitan lifestyle that is overrepresented among representatives of the upper middle class. And according to a number of studies, class inequalities in cultural consumption remain profound, but they have changed their form. They divert in important aspects from classical distinctions between highbrow culture and popular culture, in that is it more wide-ranging and discerning in cultural practices. So it is clear, less clear, to what extent the diversity between cultural fields extends to the effect of the parents' class and educational resources on cultural capital than are considered as key factor in shaping cultural activity. Generally, it shows that differences in cultural participation between the higher and lower educated have to be partly attributed to differences in the family of origin. According to some findings, impact of the latter on the music taste appears to be even stronger than effect of education itself. We will examine to what extent the generative schemas of the cultural capital defined in these terms apply across different fields of consumption so as to produce a unified set of disposition. In doing so, we focus on musical tastes regarded as the most powerful area of the class culture. The question to be are the following. Are there signs that effects of social origins, education, and class position on musical taste adhere to the idea of homology of cultural activity and social spaces? Are there signs that the rampant variety of musical taste has rendered the idea of a strong structuring of cultural consumption obstacle? In order to determine these questions, we distinguish between classical music, rock, considered as a new value attributed to cosmopolitanism, and disco polo music that is representative for popular culture. Our hypothesis is as follows. Given a rising diversity of musical genres, the structure of the space of musical preferences is not homologous to that of the space of social positions. We predict that distribution of musical tastes is not systematically structured along class lines. It displays in various effects of social origins, respondents' class, and educational level on preferences for classical music, rock, and disco polo.
Okay, so my name is Dariusz Przybysz, and I will tell you about our project. This is the title of our project, and it is conducted by Institute of Philosophy and Sociology, Polish Academy of Sciences. It is a grant funded by National Science Center. The project consists of quantitative and qualitative part, but this presentation focuses only on quantitative research. The research was based on random sample. More than 2,000 persons were interviewed. The fieldwork was conducted by two research agencies, Dana and Realizacja, and you can see the response rate in our research on this slide. We focus on musical tastes. It is dependent variable if our analysis. Actually, three indicators. The first indicators is indicator of enjoying classical music. It was based on 10 dichotomic variables. The first indicate whether respondent answered spontaneously in open-ended question whether he listened classical music or he listened some creators of classical music. Other dichotomic variables were based on a closed-ended question. There was a question whether respondent likes classical music using 5-point scale. We selected those respondents who answered that they like classical music or that they like it very much. There were also similar questions about composers like Bach, Mozart, or Richard Wagner. In our questionnaire, there was also a part when respondents were listening to the pieces of music. Every one of them was about 30 seconds. We included 5 pieces of classical music. It was music composed by Boulez, Bach, Beethoven, Puccini, Tchaikovsky. The respondent was listening to the piece and then answered whether he or she likes this music or not. So our indicator of liking classical music was based on 10 dichotomic variables. In a similar way, there were constructed indicators whether respondent liked disco polo music or not. But in this case, we had 5 dichotomic variables. You can see them on this slide. And on this slide, you can see the question related to rock music. In this case, we have only questions related to rock band, Metallica, Led Zeppelin, U2, Nirvana, whether respondent like this rock band or not, and also answers about a piece of Pink Floyd music. It was, as far as I remember, Time piece. Okay, well, as you can see, this indicator was based on different number of dichotomic variables. To compare results for these 3 indicators, we rescaled these indicators to 0-10 scale. So every indicator of classical music, rock music, and disco polo music is measured on 0 to 10 scale. We used many independent variables in our analysis to explain differences in musical tastes. We include variables which describe social position of respondent, his father and his mother. We used EGP class scheme. EGP, so it was created by Erickson, Goldthorpe, and Portocarrero. We also used information about respondent level of education, but also other variables, whether respondent had records in his home when he was young. We expected that musical tastes of respondents' parents may influence musical taste of respondent. Because of that, we use question whether father liked classical music, rock music, or disco polo music. Similar questions were about mother of respondent. We also include whether respondent have some experience with playing an instrument, but in this question we excluded experience from a regular school. If respondent was playing instrument in music school, we included this information. Okay, so and we had some also some control variables like sex, age, place of residence. Here we have some results. Let me start with simple analysis when you compare how respondents from different occupational categories like classical music, rock music, and disco polo music. We can see that means for classical music, manual workers and farmers like this music much lower than non-manual workers. Especially, you can see that this means of liking classical music is highest for professionals and managers. For rock music, the picture is generally the same, but differences are a little smaller. For example, you can see that the highest score of liking rock music is for a category of owners. For disco polo music, the ordering of categories is opposite. Professional and managers like this music less than respondents from manual categories and then farmers. Okay, here we have results of multiple correlation analysis. And this is some kind of summary. So we have information about R-square coefficient. They usually are interpreted as how what percentage of variance they explain. And we can see that in case of classical music, about 37% are explained by these variables we included in our analysis. But we also what could be interesting to see whether these variables have influence on musical tastes if we control other variables in our model. Because of that, we also calculated partial coefficient R-square. We can see that generally all of these variables have some input to explain differences in musical tastes, but we see that that these coefficients are higher for age in case of classical music, parents' musical preferences, and some information about respondents, whether he learned to play instrument apart from school. Also, level of education of respondent was important independent explanatory variable. In case of rock, we have some differences. Parents' musical preferences are not so important, but still they explain some part of musical tastes of our respondents.
I'm sorry, after the rock section, which is very interesting, can you move to conclusion so that we will have time for discussion, because I'm very positive there will be some questions. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
But don't skip this part.
Okay, so here we have some detailed results. Generally, we can see that parameters for classical music are similar to rock music, but they, if you compare, for example, education, and well, here we have some conclusion. So, Kasia, can you tell us about conclusions?
Yes, of course. Those analyses presented by Darek has shown that the structure of the space of musical taste in Poland is not systematically homologous to that of the space of social positions. More specifically, we have shown that the homologous model works quite well in case of preferences for classical music and preferences for rock, in that these follow the lines of the highbrow-lowbrow division. According to expectations, preferences for disco polo are shaped other way around, in that these are less liked among upper middle class, so-called new intelligentsia, and are liked mostly by lower classes. It turned us to more general issues of redefinition of the prestigious art forms. Our findings suggest that rock is one of the musical genres that were upgraded to the dominant culture, supplementally in this role classical music. Indeed, this might be attributed to the national Polish circumstances. Thank you very much.
Okay, very short conclusions. Okay, so now I think it's time for discussion. We have time for discussion. If somebody would like to have a comment or a follow-up to these conclusions.
Hello.
Yes.
I'm Shankar here. Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, I enjoyed this presentation.
Thank you.
And I was just curious to know in what are the kind of sites or spaces in which these forms of music are often being listened to or performed. So I just want to understand within Poland, what are those urban spaces or rural spaces or spaces in general where these the music, the genres of music that you have taken into consideration are being listened to or performed, or even being disseminated.
I don't know if I get you right. If I get right your question, you are asking why we have chosen those 4 genres, not other ones?
Okay.
No,
I'm asking what are those areas, or what are those spaces, regions or locations in which these forms of music are being consumed?
Okay, I understand.
I also have a question. Are you collecting questions or?
Yes.
Okay.
We are collecting, yes. Feel free.
I was wondering, because you chose a music and musical examples which to me are related to some generational issues, and I can imagine that with classical music, it's you chose the pieces that are kind of more or less widely known, but also, I don't know, in case of the rock music, you chose the pieces which are specific in popularity, at least, to a certain generation of Polish people, not to all the generation you were studying. And so there might be also some kind of generational aspect to, if you notice that some generations were more responsive to that questions because the examples you gave were more familiar to them than other ones. And similarly, what I noticed with the disco polo is really a phenomenon genre in Polish culture, and you also chose the examples which are basically widely known, and doesn't matter highbrow or lowbrow, people know those songs, and even if they love classical music, they might still admit, but like those specific examples. And so that's my question. How do you see that the specific example influence some song in some way by being representative for certain generations? And saying that, I don't know if you saw, but in Polish Ethnographic Museum there was recently the disco polo exposition, beautifully showing how how disco polo the music as a genre is really a voice of the Polish political transformation.
Of course.
Showing hopes and expectations related to that early capitalism in Poland. So that's also might be really reflected in that specific popularity of disco polo for certain going through the transformations. Yeah.
Maybe I will start with Justyna's question, where first of all, if you're asking about familiarity of these pieces that were presented to the respondents, one of the question was if they recognize, and nevertheless we ask if they like it. It doesn't matter if you know who is the author, and so this was helpful because you might not know but still like it, right? And it was very difficult element of questionnaire because those kind of questions with listening to music are not often used in social surveys, so it was kind of methodological experiment also. So I think it was the part of this our questionnaire that was discussed for the longest period, and we made also pilotage and so on. And if you ask about generations differences, of course, and if you said about disco polo, because it, of course, like Monica the author of this exhibition and Monika Borys and the book on disco polo, she noticed that this is the question of disco polo rising with a Polish system transformation. But we noticed that the older generation like so-called muzyka biesiadna. So it can be translated to English like Schlager music from German, because it's difficult to find the exact notion. So disco polo somehow arise from the Schlager music that was known by our parents and grandparents, and this muzyka biesiadna is more popular in older generations. So your impressions are right. Darek, do you have maybe something to add to my comments?
Well, of course, age is important variable. As you can see on this slide, parameters for age are important for explaining rock music, but in this model you have many variables, and you can see that not only age is statistically significant. So even if you control differences in age, still parameters for education are significant. So age is important variable, but it doesn't explain everything.